Hey everyone, Jonathan Lampel here from the Retopoflow team. We recently released Retopoflow 4.1, and in this video, I want to walk you through it. Retopoflow 4.0 came out in October, and since then we've been busy fixing bugs and adding a couple of the top feature requests. One of the first things you might notice when you switch into Retopoflow mode by selecting any of the tools is that the Retopology overlay looks a little bit different. This is because we've added new themes for the Retopology overlay like there were in Retopoflow 3. To change the theme, you can go to the General settings under Interface, or you can also find this in the sidebar or the tool properties under General and Interface. If you want to go back to Blender's theme, then you can just switch this to Blender, and that'll use whatever's set up for the Retopology overlay in the user preferences. But I found working with this a little bit challenging sometimes because the Retopology overlay doesn't have a lot of opacity. And so if I were to delete a face, here you can kind of tell a difference. But in some cases, it was hard to tell whether or not there was a missing face. So it was just a little bit too transparent. And personally, I didn't love how the orange didn't quite match with the blue, but maybe that's just personal taste. You can always set this back to Blender if you want, but the default is now blue. It's a little higher contrast and should be easier to see. But in addition to that, we also have green, orange, pink, and purple. Underneath that, you can also change the vertex size and edge width while you're in Retopoflow mode. So if you want thicker edges, then you can do that. And when you jump out of Retopoflow, everything will go back to normal. Same thing with the vertex size. I've also moved the offset for the Retopology overlay into the tool settings header because it's such an important option and a lot of people were not changing it. So for example, here we have a really small object, so we'd want to reduce our overlay offset just a little bit, and that way it won't poke through the mesh. Now, to get into some of the more practical changes, the first thing that I'm really excited about is the improvements to Polypen's knife. One of the key limitations that we had going back for quite a while is that you had to cut through faces one by one. You had to start on one end and click, 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 whereas now you can just simply hold down Control and slice through as many faces as you need to. So when you're using Polypen, holding Control and going outside of the existing mesh will create faces, but holding down Control and clicking inside faces is going to be a knife cut. So you can either place a point inside of an edge and start from there, or what's really cool in this version is that if you select the edge and then hold down Control, it's going to act a little bit more like a loop cut. And this is a really great way of adding partial loops into your mesh. What makes this really handy is that even if you have parts of your mesh that are curved, you can still slice them just like so. Another thing that was not working in previous versions of Polypen's knife that does work now is you can slice as many cuts as you want into a face. So for example, I can start on this vertex, make any number of cuts, and then as soon as I connect this to the other side, those faces are going to be split and you won't get any overlapping topology. If I were to partially cut into a face and not connect it to the other side, then that's just going to be floating off into space. But as soon as I connect this to an edge or a vertex and split that face, those are going to be split. So this is going to make it really easy to slice up n-gons and insert junctions. And speaking of junctions, Polypen's knife can also automatically insert junctions now, which is not something I've really seen in any other tool. The way to do it is to make a cut or a select vertex on one side of a quad, hold down Control for knife, and then hover over an adjacent edge. That signals to Polypen that you want to take that corner, and so we can really quickly redirect our loops. If you want to turn this off, then you can turn off knife junctions in the tool settings, and that way if you make a cut, go to the opposite edge, then you can make a triangle, but we found that we spent a lot of time making these same cuts to make the same junctions, and it's a lot nicer that Polypen can now just do it for you. Polypen's knife also got a couple of bug fixes, so it should be much more reliable as well. Another feature that's completely new to Retopoflow is Topo Rotate. This is something that Dr. Denning came up with while he was working on patches, which is still in progress, but we figured this might be useful for you guys even before patches comes out. And the way that it works is that you select any section of faces and then hit Alt-R, and you can see this in the status bar as well. Alt-R is Topo Rotate. And that's going to rotate the topology of the selection. So for example, let's say we have this lined up along the x-axis, but we want this main loop to actually run along the y-axis instead, we can hit Alt-R and rotate that into place. So this is one that you're probably not going to need all the time, but it's really handy when you do need it. And when it comes to working with patches in the future, then that's definitely going to be where it shines. Another new feature, we actually need to switch over to Blender 5.1 to look at. So here I'm in Blender 5.1, and one of the new features of Blender 5.1 is that if you select a loop, you now get a redo panel with where exactly that loop ends. And when we're talking about the boundary loop, we can now stop at inner corners. So I'll hold down Shift and stop that at the inner corner. And this is really helpful when it comes to working with strokes. So it's on by default when you're working with strokes. And when you go back to the rest of Blender, the default behavior is preserved. But when we're working with Retopoflow, we pretty much always want to end at those inner corners, just so we can very quickly drag a line and fill that in. Now, this is something that I was actually able to add to Blender itself, and it made it into 5.1, so I'm very excited about that. It's one of my first feature additions to Blender, and also it works with regular loops and seams and sharp edges and things like that. So even outside of the use for Retopoflow, if you have a seam, just like so, you make a loop cut, you can decide to stop at that seam as well. But also for Retopoflow, it's helpful for if you have n-gons. So let's say we have, some n-gon here, just like that, and we want to be able to select this whole edge loop, then we could deselect the n-gon delimit and select right through it, and continue on with strokes. So I hope you find that helpful both in Retopoflow and just in Blender in general. And we definitely hope to add more modeling improvements to Blender itself as we continue developing Retopoflow. Your support helps make that possible, so thank you so much for purchasing Retopoflow. Another thing that's new in Retopoflow 4.1 is that Tweak and Relax now have pinning options, where you can select some vertices, let's just say this whole edge loop here, and we can choose to pin them. And now when I move, those are going to stay put. And same thing in Relax, those are going to stay put. So up here in the tool settings, you can choose to pin or unpin, but you can also use other attributes of the mesh. For example, if we have this edge as a seam, Control E, mark seam, we could choose to not transform seams, just like so, just uncheck seams. And now anything that's not along a seam will get moved. There we go, the seam stays put and everything else gets moved. So you can also do that with corners, which was already possible before, but now sharp edges, creases, pinned verts, and also occluded. So that was definitely a big feature request because we had some pinning in Retopoflow 3 and it was missing in Retopoflow 4, but we wanted to make sure that we did it in a way that was performance efficient and didn't require drawing custom overlays that might slow everything down at higher poly counts. A couple other smaller quality of life things in this version is that if you picked shortest path before, Control, Shift, and left click, that always worked along a boundary, but if you were doing that through a mesh, you could sometimes accidentally select faces, and that's no longer the case. So for example, if I went from here to here, previously that would have fill region checked on because that's Blender's hotkey for it is Control Shift rather than just Control click. But since you can't use Control click in Retopoflow, since that's the polypen insert hotkey, then we just changed the key map a little bit so that Control Shift does not fill region. So that should make things a little bit easier for you. Also hotkey related, we made it so that the W pie menu can be toggled outside of Retopoflow mode. And this is a preference that you can set in the add-on preferences. Also, Blender's status bar now shows a whole bunch of hotkey hints for each tool. The Relax tool is now up to 5 times faster. Contours is now about 2 times faster. And now you only get the middle dot when that's the only thing that's being calculated. And you get the outside dots when we're using one of the other methods. So you can see skip and walk both only use the center point, but fast uses the 2 on the outside. And so that's only drawn now when it's needed. If you're using mirroring, then the merge distance has been added to the mirroring panel. Deleting edges without faces is now off by default in the cleanup operator. And beyond that, it was just a ton of bug fixes. And as usual, if you have any issues with this version of Retopoflow, please let us know. Also, if you have any feature requests, you can also email us at any time. We know that the biggest request right now is the patches tool, and we are absolutely working on that. And I'm very excited to be able to show that to you in the future because it's going to be much more powerful than it was in version 3. So that's it for this update. If you haven't seen the full Retopoflow 4 course, then you can also now watch that on our YouTube channel to dive deeper into the tools and how to get started. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.